Imagine standing on a beach 50,000 years ago. There is no compass, no map, no engine, and no lighthouse waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. In front of you is open ocean stretching toward islands you cannot reach on foot. Yet somehow humans crossed it. They carried fire, food, tools, and perhaps children pushed away from land and trusted a vessel they had built with their own hands. The strangest part is that this happened thousands of generations before anyone could write down how it was done. So how did humans learn to sail? The answer begins much earlier than the first sail. Long before people learned to harness the wind, they had already learned something even more important. Water could be crossed. Rivers, lakes, marshes, and coastal waters were not simply barriers. They were places filled with fish, shellfish, birds, plants, and new land on the other side. At first, crossing a river may have meant holding onto a floating log. A person could discover that wood stayed above the water, that a bundle of reeds could support weight, and that a hollowed tree trunk could carry a human farther than swimming ever could. These simple observations may sound obvious to us, but they were the beginning of one of humanity's greatest technological revolutions. We do not know what the first boat looked like. Almost certainly, it was not a carefully designed canoe. Organic materials such as wood, bark, reeds, and fiber usually decay, leaving archaeologists with only fragments or nothing at all. That means the oldest boat we have found is not necessarily the oldest boat humans ever built. It is simply the oldest one that survived long enough for us to discover it. One remarkable example is the Pes canoe, found in the Netherlands. It was carved from a single pine trunk and dates to roughly 8,000 years ago. At nearly 3 meters long, it was simple, but it proves that prehistoric people could shape a tree into a functional watercraft thousands of years before the first cities appeared. But there is a problem with this story. If the first surviving canoe is only about 8,000 years old, how could humans have reached Australia tens of thousands of years earlier? The islands between Southeast Asia and the ancient continent of Sahul were never connected by a continuous land bridge. To reach Sahul, humans had to cross stretches of open water. Some crossings may have approached 100 kilometers, and researchers have modeled voyages that would have taken several days. Exactly when these crossings began remains debated, with different studies supporting dates around 50,000 years ago or even earlier. But there is broad agreement on one extraordinary point. Humans were capable of intentional maritime movement long before the first surviving boats appeared in the archaeological record. That changes the question completely. Humans did not suddenly invent sailing one day. They probably spent thousands of years learning how water behaved, how floating objects moved, and how to control a craft. The earliest travelers may have stayed close to shore, where land remained visible. They could paddle along a coastline, follow familiar landmarks, and return home before darkness. But eventually, someone had to make a decision that would change human history: leave the shoreline and travel toward a place that could not be reached by walking. Perhaps that decision was not as dramatic as we imagine. An island might have been visible across a narrow channel. Birds could be seen flying toward it. Smoke from a distant fire might have suggested another human settlement. A storm might have pushed a boat away from shore and accidentally carried its passengers toward land they had never seen before. We cannot know exactly how the first open-water voyages happened. Archaeology gives us clues, but it cannot recover the thoughts of people who lived tens of thousands of years ago. What we can say is that surviving on islands required more than luck. Repeated movement between islands strongly suggests that people developed ways to make water crossings work. And this is where one of the most important discoveries appears. Sailing was probably not the beginning of seafaring. It was a later improvement. A person can move a canoe with a paddle. A group can push it with poles in shallow water. A rope can pull it from shore, but paddling across a large body of water requires enormous energy. Wind, however, is free. Once humans realized that moving air could push a boat, the ocean itself could become a source of power. The basic idea sounds almost ridiculously simple. Put something upright on a boat. Attach a large piece of flexible material to it. Let the wind push against that surface. But turning that simple idea into a reliable system would have been much harder. A sail does not merely push a boat forward. Depending on its shape, the direction of the wind, and the angle of the sail, it can push the boat sideways, rotate it, or make it unstable. The people who first experimented with sails did not have modern physics to explain any of this. They learned through observation, failure, and repeated experimentation. We do not know exactly where or when the first sail was invented. There may never have been a single inventor. Different communities could have experimented independently with wind-powered boats. The earliest direct evidence is especially difficult to identify because sails themselves were usually made from materials that rarely survive. Instead, archaeologists often have to rely on images, models, boat remains, and indirect evidence. In ancient Egypt, representations of sailing vessels appear in the archaeological record, and by the 3rd millennium BCE, Egyptian boats were clearly using large sails and sophisticated rigging. A surviving Old Kingdom relief from around 2465 to 2458 BCE shows a large sail filling with wind while sailors work aboard the vessel. But even before these magnificent Egyptian ships appeared, boat technology had already been changing. A hollowed log was useful, but it had limits. It could carry only so much weight, and its shape was constrained by the size of the tree. People began combining materials using reeds, planks, fibers, and waterproof coatings. In the Persian Gulf, archaeological evidence from the 6th and 5th millennia BCE shows that communities were building boats from bundles of reeds and coating them with bitumen to make them more resistant to water. At the site of H3 in Kuwait, archaeologists found evidence including a model of a reed boat, a depiction interpreted as a sailing boat, and pieces of bitumen bearing impressions associated with reed-built vessels. These discoveries point to maritime activity thousands of years before the great ships of later civilizations. Now consider what this means. A boat capable of crossing a river is one thing. A boat capable of carrying goods across the Persian Gulf is something completely different. It requires construction skills, waterproofing, knowledge of currents, an understanding of weather, and a reason to make the journey. Trade may have been one of the strongest forces pushing these technologies forward. Once people discovered that distant communities possessed valuable materials they could not easily obtain at home, the sea stopped being just a dangerous space between settlements. It became a highway, and that highway demanded a new kind of knowledge. Imagine leaving shore in a small boat. At first, the coastline is easy to follow. Then the land becomes smaller behind you. The wind changes. Waves begin to arrive from a different direction. The sun moves across the sky. If clouds cover the stars, familiar landmarks disappear. Suddenly, survival depends on understanding things that cannot be touched: wind direction, currents, waves, weather, and the position of the sun and stars. This is where sailing and navigation became inseparable. A sailor did not need to understand the science of ocean currents to use them. Generations of observation could accomplish the same thing. People could remember that certain winds arrived during certain seasons, that birds appeared in particular areas, that waves behaved differently near reefs, or that a particular star appeared in a particular direction. Knowledge could be passed from one generation to another without a single written map. Some of the most impressive examples came much later in the Pacific. Austronesian and Polynesian voyagers developed extraordinarily capable sailing canoes and navigation systems that allowed them to cross enormous stretches of ocean. Their technology included outrigger systems for stability, sails, steering paddles, and carefully designed hulls. Research using archaeology, sailing simulations, and engineering experiments shows that early Pacific canoes were capable of voyages across island Melanesia and into western Polynesia. Later Polynesian voyagers developed even more advanced boats and navigation strategies for the vast distances of the Central and Eastern Pacific. But there is an important twist here. When we imagine ancient sailors, we often picture people simply following the wind. That is not enough. If a boat can only travel in the direction the wind happens to blow, its usefulness is limited. The real breakthrough was learning how to control the relationship between wind, sail, hull, and steering system. With the right design, sailors could travel at angles to the wind rather than simply being blown wherever the air pushed them. This transformed sailing from passive drifting into controlled movement. The boat itself also had to change. Stability became critical. A tall sail creates power, but it also creates forces that can tip a narrow boat. An outrigger can dramatically increase stability by placing a float beside the main hull. A wider hull can carry more cargo but may move differently through the water. A deeper or differently shaped hull can improve tracking. Every improvement creates another problem to solve. Ancient boat building was therefore not a single invention. It was a long chain of experiments in which one solution created the need for another, and the people making these improvements were not working with equations. They were working with memory. A skilled boat builder could know which tree produced the best hull. A sailor could know when a seasonal wind would change. A navigator could recognize a coastline by its shape or identify a distant island from the behavior of birds and clouds. This kind of knowledge was a form of technology, even though it was stored inside human minds rather than books. The greatest surprise may be that humans probably became sailors before they became sophisticated boat builders. The archaeological evidence from Sahul suggests that people were already capable of crossing substantial stretches of ocean long before the oldest surviving boats. That means the first seafarers were not necessarily building beautiful ships. They may have been using surprisingly simple craft. perhaps made from materials that disappeared thousands of years ago. The technology was important, but so was something harder to measure: the willingness to leave the safety of land. Think about what that required. A person had to believe there was a reason to go somewhere they had never been. Someone had to trust a vessel that could sink. Someone had to look at a horizon filled with uncertainty and decide that the unknown was worth the risk. And once one voyage succeeded, the knowledge could be remembered. The next generation could go farther. Then another generation could go farther still. This may help explain why the history of sailing is really a history of accumulated courage and accumulated knowledge. The first sailor did not need to understand the entire ocean. They only needed to discover one useful thing. Perhaps a certain wind could push a raft. Perhaps a particular current carried boats toward another island. Perhaps a simple sail could reduce the effort needed to travel. One observation became a technique became a tradition became a technology. By the time ancient civilizations were building large sailing vessels, the basic relationship between humans and the sea had already been transformed. In Egypt, boats were not merely fishing platforms. Ships were part of political power, religion, trade, and long-distance transport. Archaeological evidence from Abydos shows that early Egyptian boat building had become highly organized, with large wooden vessels constructed from planks and designed for movement on the Nile and for transport over land toward the Red Sea. By the middle of the 4th millennium BCE, ships had become a major technological force within Egyptian society. And yet, even these impressive ships were only one branch of a much larger human experiment. Across different regions, people developed different answers to the same problem. How do you move safely across water? Some built reed boats, others carved trees into canoes, some stitched or lashed materials together. Others developed plank-built vessels. Some used paddles, some poles, some sails, and eventually many used combinations of all three. There was never one moment when humanity suddenly learned to sail. There was no prehistoric inventor standing on a beach shouting, "I have discovered the sail." The process was much more human than that. It was thousands of small discoveries made by people whose names we will never know. A better paddle, a stronger rope, a more stable hull, a different way to attach a mast, a better season for traveling, a remembered star, a safer route between islands. And every one of those discoveries expanded the size of the human world. Before boats, a river could be a border. After boats, it could become a road. Before seafaring, an island could be an isolated world. After seafaring, islands could become part of a network. Before sailing, the horizon represented the edge of what humans could easily reach. After sailing, the horizon became an invitation. So how did humans learn to sail? Not by suddenly mastering the ocean, but by first learning to float, then learning to paddle, then learning to build stronger boats, and eventually learning to use the wind itself. The oldest surviving boats show that people had mastered watercraft thousands of years ago, while the much earlier settlement of Sahul shows that humans were making substantial sea crossings long before those boats survived in the ground. Later civilizations turned these scattered skills into increasingly powerful systems of sailing, navigation, trade, and exploration. The ocean was never conquered, it was learned, and perhaps that is the most remarkable part of the story. Every modern ship, every sailing yacht, every cargo vessel crossing an ocean can trace its ancestry back to an ancient human observation. Wood floats, wind moves, and the unknown might be worth crossing. Somewhere in the distant past, someone looked beyond the shore and decided to try. We do not know their name. We do not know what their boat looked like, and we may never know exactly where they went. But they pushed away from land. And with that single decision, the human world became much, much larger.